So let me start by thanking Maria and the organizers for inviting me to give this talk, which is a particularly pleasant experience given the amount of friendly faces in the audience and also very interesting presentations in the conference program. So I have two main aims with my presentation. The first one is to give an overview of my interpretation of the current state of research in the field. So this should be useful for those of you who don't work on these topics. And the second aim is to identify and discuss some interesting potential ways forward and current research gaps in the field. So I was asked to give an overview, so I will slip in as much of my research as possible, but I will be mainly big picture. So let me start then by the big picture. Of course, the problem, we all know what the problem is. It's the excessive footprint of human resources, of human societies, on natural resources and natural environments. And in particular, the most prominent problem that we have at the moment is climatic change. There is, in theory, one simple solution to climate change, which is moving to a net zero, a low-carbon economic system. Now, decarbonization, in its essence, it's a process of structural change. So something that we experienced already, human societies have experience with those, and we also have studied them as social scientists. But I would argue that the low-carbon transition exhibits some peculiar features that call for additional, deeper investigation. For instance, obviously, the timeline of the low-carbon transition is much more compressed compared to past technological transitions, which were also based on the emergence, on the natural emergence, if you will, of more productive, more profitable technologies, which is not the case for now, at least not for the moment. The society itself is different now, right? So population has never been this big. We have never been so dependent on a specific material like we are on fossil fuels. The interconnectedness of society and economic system is stronger than ever. And of course, we have also stronger than ever financialization. So this, I believe, raises two main research questions that are being addressed at the moment. The first one is, how do we rapidly transition to a low-carbon economy, which you can decline then in how do we finance, how do we move these financial resources from high-carbon incumbent technologies to low-carbon ones? And the second question is, how do we make it happen in a smooth, orderly, non-disruptive fashion, which again can be declined as how do we avoid financial crisis and macroeconomic disruptions along the transition or because of the transition. So are we able to answer these questions? Do we have the right tools to answer them? Well, first of all, what tools do we have? And for many years, probably the only game in town in climate economics has been integrated assessment modeling, right? So there is no escaping this guy that you say in the picture, who is, of course, William Nordhaus, recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2018 for his work in climate economics, and in particular, the development of the DICE model, which is the godfather of all integrated assessment models. The model also had many offsprings. Some took the form of large-scale numerical models. These are very granular when it comes to technologies and pollutants. And so this is also the reason why they are behind usually the IPCC trajectories. But if you look at their economic module, it's actually quite simple, right? It's a Ramsey growth type of setting with an intertemporal optimization of a simple utility function based on per capita consumption and a supply-side production function. You also have so-called analytical integrated assessment models. These are reducing the complexity on the climate side, right? So just a few equations in order to get to analytical results. And the typical result that they get is a carbon price path that allows you to get an optimal transition, right? So social cost of carbon, carbon prices, this is what they are after. I would also put in this category CGE models that are different, of course, because they have this multi-regional and multi-sectoral perspective. Also, the computational method behind it is slightly different, but you know, it's reasonable to argue that they are also based on neoclassical assumptions. So at some point, we started a demand for macro financial considerations started emerging. This was due to many reasons: the global financial crisis, the increasingly biting climate change signals that make the transition more urgent, and we found ourselves with very few tools, right? Because integrated assessment model and CGE models, as I was saying, they have a very limited economic, macroeconomic and financial part. Also, environmental and ecological economics, which you can consider as a sort of a mainstream and a heterodox version of the scholars looking at the interaction between humans and environments, they have been traditionally not particularly interested in macro matters. And macroeconomics, on the other hand, both neoclassical and heterodox, for many years has not been particularly interested in environment. Plus, we realized that we lacked a lot of very relevant data that we need, and empirical analysis to inform the models. We also lack, if you will, the imagination for what concerns possible future scenarios and how to address them, right? So the policy debate. So as a result, a number of new research streams popped up. And let me give you a brief overview of those, which I categorize in four main streams. So first of all, we have this bunch of works developing qualitative analysis of possible transition futures, right? So for instance, this paper, co-authored also by Gregor Semenyuk, who is also here at the conference. In this paper, we essentially tried to give a systematic overview of the drivers, transmission channels, and impacts that a low-carbon transition could have on macro and financial dynamics. And the key concept here in the debate, which we also discuss, is this concept of a green swan, a climate Minsky moment, a disorderly transition, right? So the idea of an abrupt and unanticipated manifestation of the urgency to decarbonize, which leads to economic costs, and these create financial costs, and these create systemic costs. So this is, if you want, let's say, the pre-modeling stage, like what are we worried about? What do we want to understand, and how do we address it? The NGFS, the network of central banks and supervisors for greening the financial system, is also very active in this qualitative analysis kind of work. I would also add that there is new work coming out also using the toolkit of this socio-technical transition theory literature, which is a good thing because it's going to be useful. There's a bunch of empirical work coming out. Some of it has to do with financial assets and pricing. So for instance, are climate risks or transition risks already internalized in asset prices? Question mark. Some other works are looking instead at fossil reserves and capital stocks, calculate the embodied emissions and compare them with the carbon budgets that we have at our disposal, hence leading to some stranding risk analysis, like how much of that capital stock can we actually use in a 2-degree world. And some other works instead use network analysis. So these look both at production networks and financial networks. Let me just give you a snapshot. This is a paper co-authored also with Antoine Gaudin and Eric and Benedict, both of whom are also here at the conference. And essentially what we do is we analyze what happens when you have a shock, a supply side shock in a fossil sector of a specific country, and we study how this creates stranding of capital in that sector, but also in downstream sectors and other countries via international production networks, right? And so we identify these so-called capital stranding cascades. And there's a lot of other work also coming out using network analysis. I will come back to networks later on. There's, again, lots of policy debate, looking at past policies and analyzing how green they are, say, looking at the carbon bias of quantitative easing programs of central banks. This is one thing that could be done. Or we could design and test new potential policies. So Maria and Yannis have been working a lot on this, looking, for instance, at this idea of green differentiated capital requirements. And of course, these policies need to be implemented by someone, right? So this raises the whole institutional question. So again, there's research looking at the role of central banks, supervisors, what they can do, what they can't do, what they should do, and so on. And finally, modeling, right? So all of this I say also because, of course, modeling is supposed to incorporate inputs and give outputs to all these other streams of work. And when it comes to modeling, as usual, we can distinguish two big families, the neoclassical equilibrium modeling approach and the complexity non-equilibrium heterodox approach, however you want to define it. So let me give you just a few quick words about what's going on in these modeling fields. So large-scale integrated assessment models, the IPCC models that I discussed already at the beginning, my feeling is that there's not much to do there because they are interested, but they are already too complex to treat macro-financial dimensions within the model. A promising avenue, however, is the coupling of integrated assessment models with other macro models, right? So for instance, this is what the NGFS again is doing. They're taking 3 integrated assessment models and then they take some carbon price, path and other variables and they use them as inputs for macro model, the general equilibrium models in that case. Another example is something that Andrea is also involved in, which is coupling the WICH model, which is this big integrated assessment model with the DSK, which is an agent-based model. But maybe Andrea will talk about this later on. Analytical integrated assessment models, in this case, there is some stuff going on, especially including stranding of physical assets. But I would say that the analytical integrated assessment models by themselves, maybe they're not, they are limited in what they can do, right? Because they are analytical. And as soon as you raise the complexity, you're having issues. Of course, the other possibility is to put aside the integrated assessment model, the climate econ stuff, and go to macroeconomics, right? And in a neoclassical world, the easiest thing to do is to take a DSG model, like hundreds of papers already being written on that, and add something about climate. At the end, it's not too difficult. You need some way of producing emissions, right? So this is a function of production or dirty capital stocks. You need climate damages that affect production or labor or productivity or growth, and you need an abatement function. You need something that the policymaker can use in order to abate the emissions, right? So sometimes you don't even necessarily need the climate damages. So as a result, a number of papers are coming out on this. If you're interested, this NBER paper that came out recently gives a summary. But essentially what they do, the main thing that they do is that they test different mitigation policies, right? And they see how they perform under productivity shocks and monetary shocks and the whole DSG typical approach. A similar but different approach is the financial macro way. In some ways, this financial macro is partly overlapping with with analytical integrated assessment models. And of course, in this case, the stress is on uncertainty and the right pricing under uncertainty, right? So one result of these models is what is the optimal green premium or dirty premium along an optimal transition. You have the whole complexity economic modeling chapter. I will be brief on this because, of course, we have Maria and Andrea that will focus on this. But essentially, we have stock flow consistent models and agent-based models that are similar in spirit, at least to my understanding, to stock flow consistent model. But of course, they have interacting agents within sectors. And both of them have been used in recent years to try to answer climate-related or transition-related questions. I would add also another partly overlapping field of research, which are these diffusion models, which are based more on a discrete choice theory foundation. So the idea, I think, is to introduce heterogeneity in these models without actually having agents, right? And the work by Jean-François Mercure and co-authors is probably the most prominent example of this line of research applied to low carbon transitions. Okay, so this is what has been going on. What's missing? Of course, I could go in many different directions now. Let me stress 3 directions that I personally feel are the most relevant, the most interesting, and have to do with expectations, uncertainty, and networks. Expectations. So the expectations of firms and households concerning the coming low-carbon transition are likely to be key in defining the transition dynamics itself, right? So your expectations on the timing and speed and strength of mitigation policies will affect your investment behavior today. The same goes for your expectations about the decline of low-carbon technology costs. All of these expectations influence your behavior today. So since we want to shift investments, we need to understand this part. And my understanding is that there are 3 main key features of expectations that are relevant for transition modeling. First, they are forward-looking. That is, they concern something that has yet to happen in the medium and long term. But the expectations that are actually relevant for investment behavior are only the ones that are within a certain finite planning horizon. So I might have expectations about what happens to the transition in 100 years. This will probably not affect my investment decisions today. But what happens in the next 5, 10, maybe 20 years, depending on who I am, what my role in society is, they might. Second, they might be misinformed. They might be based on partial information and are subject to cognitive biases. And second, they are heterogeneous. So your expectations are unlikely to be the same as mine. So what matters at the end from a systemic perspective is actually the aggregate distribution of these expectations. The current transition modeling approaches, with some exceptions, they do not capture the whole richness of these expectations element. So on one side, we have the typical neoclassical model, which has forward-looking expectations, right, with an infinite horizon. They tend to be not heterogeneous. They tend to be homogeneous with a representative agent. And then my investment behavior is determined by what is optimal to do, right, that by the intertemporal optimization of my welfare function or my profits. And the complexity approach, on the other hand, is usually based on adaptive expectations with a one-period horizon in front of us, right? So I take the past, I observe the past, and extrapolate to the future to the next period, right? But usually, I don't look at what happens after this next period. They can be heterogeneous, right, the expectations. They might, especially in agent-based models. they can. And then the investment behavioral function is actually based either on macroeconomic estimation or some theoretical foundations. So it's difficult, it's not impossible, but it's difficult to use the current state to include all these features. I remember in 2016, Antoine and Eric and I were here with an attempt with a model where we were trying to use a stock flow consistent model to introduce forward-looking expectations in asset pricing. And we discovered that it's absolutely not trivial to have something sensible out of it. I feel that we have some help. So there are these two particular substreams of work that have been going on, that have not been applied yet to transition modeling, but they could be useful. One is the work on diagnostic expectations. This is mainly done, to my understanding, by neoclassical economists that try to incorporate some real-world fact, right? For instance, the fact that people do extrapolate, they overreact to events, they're over-optimistic if things are going well, and so on. And the second line of work is the heterogeneous expectation work, and in this case, there is a recent paper by Karl Holmes on the Journal of Economic Literature that makes, let's say, the summary of the research on this so far. And it has a lot of applications on monetary policy, for instance, but so far it hasn't been applied that much, with some exceptions, again, to transition modeling. So this is, for instance, the direction in which we're trying to go with some co-authors. Louis Domas is also here somewhere, or will appear in the conference in the coming days. And what we do is we create this model where we have forward-looking expectations about the transition speed, and this then become expectations of stranding, of capacity utilization loss of different types of capital stocks. And these expectations are heterogeneous, and the heterogeneity also increases in psychological time. I realize that you might not be seeing this well, but basically we have this setting where we have these different central expectations. So this is expected utilization rate, right, depending on different expected speed of transition. But this is just the mean, right? Around the mean, around the central expected scenario, you have a distribution of opinions, of beliefs about what the transition will look like. And this increases in psychological time in that we might be very homogeneous in understanding what happens next period, but then what happens in 10 or 20 years, there we have very widespread beliefs, right? So there's no homogeneity in expectations. And this allows us, essentially, then we actualize everything, and this allows us to give an interpretation of low carbon investment decisions today, right? And so we have this set of pairwise sensitivity analysis using parameters for which we do not have data, right? For instance, I'll speed up. This tells us that the higher the expected transition speed, the higher will be my low carbon investments today, quite obviously, because the high carbon technology is not a convenient choice. The other chart is just a snapshot showing how we might have nonlinear effects on today's investment decisions depending on the length of my planning horizon, which is S, and my opinion conflict parameter, which is this sigma max. Okay, let me get back. I also want to mention another ongoing work with Francesco Lamperti and Roberto Terranova. In this case, we stick to the Holmes approach to modeling, where we have these beliefs that might switch, and the object of the beliefs are the credibility of policy commitments. So we have a policymaker that announces some policy for the future, and people might believe it or not. And depending on the success of expectations, people might switch from one type of belief to the other. And basically what we show is that there are interesting dynamics and possible vicious cycles when the policymaker decides the strength of its policy depending on the potential transition costs. So if nobody believes the commitment will actually stick, very few people will invest in low carbon, making transition costs potentially higher and giving a stronger incentive to the policymaker not to commit, not to default on its commitment, creating a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. Again, you know, these are things that in monetary policy are often very, very common, but again, not for the transition modeling bit. Okay. Uncertainty. This also, I feel, is a key point because there are different, multiple, and interacting sources of uncertainty. In particular, let me go back to this idea of uncertainty about a future policy implementation. So, what I expect the policy to be will influence my behavior before the policy will actually take place. And in this case, my personal feeling is that the integrated assessment model together with the financial macro approach is more advanced in treating uncertainty because they have the techniques coming from financial economics. And for instance, you can put a number of different sources and types of uncertainty, Brownian motions on your parameters, and you can incorporate Barrow-style macro disasters that you can also apply to climate and so on. So this is, for instance, something that we're doing with a couple of co-authors, and this is, again, just a quick snapshot of what we do. These are different runs depending on different value of our relative risk aversion parameter, but essentially what we try to do is to identify the optimal transition path under all these different sources of uncertainty with learning possible and also with stranding possible. So capital inertia is in the model and creates a different dynamics compared to a version of the model without capital inertia. So this is what I was meaning before when I said we have in this line of literature physical capital stranding, but there is a limit to what can be done. Right? So these simulations run for 3 days. If you want to obtain something with these optimization procedures, it's very complex to do so, and it takes a lot of time. Okay. I'm actually very interested in discussing how the complexity modeling approach treats uncertainty. So, of course, there is the point about radical uncertainty, but I wonder to what extent these methods could be employed in order to incorporate some forward-looking uncertainty source. Finally, networks. I don't think I have to convince you that an analysis of networks is important, and indeed it has been applied, as I showed you before. My perception is that the research in the field of transition modeling has been mostly static in nature, empirical. So you construct these production networks or financial networks, and then you try to make some analysis there, but it's not, I wouldn't call that dynamic modeling. And usually they are separate. So you either look at production or financial networks. And in terms of ways forward, I highlighted here some. I just want to stress, given that I'm out of time already, the fact that there is this production networks literature in economics, which is very analytical and mathematical, and I feel that also could be incorporated in the network analysis for transition modeling in a fruitful manner. I have some ongoing work with other co-authors on this, but I will skip this. So let me conclude. There's a lot of work being developed in the field of macroeconomics and finance of socio-ecological transition. It's multidimensional, and there are many things, many advances in each of these dimensions. So it's a very exciting field of research to be in. I have the feeling that, well, it is reasonable to expect that this might be the preliminary stage still, right? So probably the best research is still yet to come, right? It's being cooked up in this very moment. There are some avenues that I feel are particularly promising. I talked about these three, but of course I wanted to mention, you know, there are many other dimensions that could be explored, including asset pricing. For instance, one problem that I stumbled on in the SFC literature is the asset pricing method, which is usually based on this Tobin allocation matrix approach, which is probably not satisfactory, or at least it is not at the moment, to investigate these problems that I just discussed. There's the distribution question, there's the post-growth and degrowth question, and others. Let me then conclude by stressing, of course, that to answer all of these questions, we need multiple methods, right? We need a pluralist approach, and I would also add that we need cross-fertilization. So you've seen how, at least in this subfield, for these themes, certain streams, certain methodological approaches might be more advanced than others in exploring some specific dimension. And of course, we cannot aim for the perfect model, the ultimate joint model, but we can learn from other methodologies and other even non-modeling methodologies. Thank you very much. If you're interested, this presentation was partly adapted by this paper coming out soon on the review of environmental economics and policy. And that said, I wish you all the best for the rest of the conference, and I'm looking forward to your presentations. Thank you.